So Josh Olive is a prolific business owner in Charlotte County. He's a fifth-generation Floridian who has dedicated his personal and professional life to sharing his practical knowledge of the area. He is the fish coach, the editor of Waterline Magazine, one of the hosts of Waterline Radio, a Florida master naturalist, a snake breeder, a talented nature photographer, and truly the best person to be speaking on our topic today, which is, can I hug this? Big animals in Florida. So welcome, Josh. Take it away.
To be fair, the best person that you know, not necessarily the best, just the best one that you have on your list of people. I understand, but I don't want to oversell it. So today we are talking about, can I hug this? And that's a spoiler alert that no, you're not going to get to hug any of our wildlife. I'm very sorry about that. Most of them are dangerous. Some of them will try to kill you if you try to hug them, but that doesn't mean that they're not endlessly fascinating anyway. So let's go ahead and kick this thing off with our first species, which is one that everybody knows about, everybody wants to hug, and that's the Florida panther. Now, if you're looking at this picture, the first thing that you may notice about this panther is that it isn't black. And that's a common misconception that people have about Florida panthers, is that they must be black, because everybody knows about black panthers. But a black panther is actually a melanistic leopard. And we don't have leopards here in North America. Leopards are Asian and African. This animal is also known as a cougar or a mountain lion or a puma in other parts of its range. We just happen to call it a Florida panther here. Now, Kate, do you know the distinction between a Florida panther and a mountain lion from one of the western states in the United States?
I don't actually.
You don't know the distinction?
I don't know the distinction.
So what you do is you take both of them and you DNA test them, and you determine that they are actually not distinct at all. They're part of the same population of animals. And it makes total sense if you look at what's been happening with some of the Florida panthers that have been moving up into northern Florida and heading up into Georgia and trying to move north. As male panthers grow, they have to move out of their mother's territories, because their mother's territory is a part of their father's territory, and daddy does not want the competition. So young males get driven out of their father's territory to go find their own territories. And being large carnivores, they have huge territories, which means that the population in Florida is always trying to expand further north. But if we had a more natural situation where we didn't have panthers just driven into the southern tip of Florida, if they were covering the whole state, well, they would be sharing genetics with the panthers in Georgia and in Alabama and in Tennessee, which would be sharing genetics with the panthers in Idaho and in New Mexico. So it's one interlinked population. And they really have not been separated for long enough that we have a serious DNA difference, although we do have a genetic bottleneck going on because of the small number of breeding animals that we have in South Florida, which is why they have brought in some animals from other parts of the country to help augment our population and prevent inbreeding. So truly, there is no such thing as a Florida panther. What we have is cougars, mountain lions, pumas, panthers that live here in Florida as their own different geological location, but not really separated genetically.
We talked a little bit about that in the intro as well.
We did?
Well, I did.
I don't remember that.
No,
it was a long time ago. It's rare that you might find one in Charlotte County, but again, because they keep expanding outwards, it's possible that one might show up here. If you talk to locals, a lot of locals will tell you about the panthers that they are 100% sure that they have seen standing on the side of the road or trying to get into their chicken coop. And most of the time, those panthers are actually one of these. This is a bobcat. Now, if you look at him, you'll see that he does have a tail. A lot of people think that bobcats have either no tail or just a tiny little stub of a tail. The tail on this cat is about what I would call average length for a Florida bobcat. Now, if you look at where his foot is sticking out the back, I have seen bobcats that have tails that would hang down to about the point of that foot where his ankle is. So tails that are maybe 10 to 14 inches long are not at all uncommon in bobcats. If you look back at the panther, his tail is much, much longer. It's used for a balancing tool, and in order for it to be functional for that, it needs to be long and heavy, and it's a big tail. It's almost as big as his body length is. Bobcats have a much shorter tail, but again, because most people expect them to have no tail, seeing any tail at all will often confuse people. People also don't realize how large bobcats can be. Bobcats can be the size of a medium-sized dog. So they expect them to be smaller than that. They expect them to be more the size of a large house cat, which they can be too, especially females. So try not to confuse bobcats with panthers. It's easy to do. It's easy to do on a game cam. It's easy to do if you only get a very brief glimpse of it, but not the same animal. And a bobcat is way, way more likely to be found here locally. I would say that you probably have about a 50 to 100 times better chance of seeing a bobcat in Charlotte County than you do seeing a panther. So, and no, you can't hug either one of them, even if they're just kittens. How about him? He looks huggable, huh? A little black bear cub? Who wouldn't want to hug that? Well, the problem is she's not in the picture, but Mama Black Bear is somewhere around here. Now, we don't have too many black bears here in Charlotte County. They are possible, and they do occur sometimes in DeSoto County as well. But we see most of our black bears if you get farther south, getting down in towards the Everglades, or if you get farther north, getting up into Ocala National Forest. That's where the bulk of Florida's black bears are found. But we do have some around. So it's always possible that you could have one show up. They are going to be drawn to anything that smells like edible food, which means that if you have a trash can that's not properly secured, they may want to come to that. If you're storing bird seed or pet food on a screen porch, that is definitely something that will draw them in. Some of the guys who are cattle ranching have had issues where their sheds get broken into and their sweet feed, which is molasses based, gets eaten by the bears because they have an excellent sense of smell and they are hungry 24/7. And here in Florida, 365, because our bears don't really den up for the winter like they do up north. As you may have noticed, we don't really have a winter that's worth denning up for. So these are animals that are definitely always on the prowl, definitely always hungry, and not something that you really want to have breaking into your screen porch or breaking into your trash cans. Think of raccoons only on steroids. And of course, the potential for negative interaction is increased when we have these animals feeding on our properties. So it's not something that we want to do. So just make sure that you keep foods away from the bears. Your trash cans need to be properly sealed. They need to be not necessarily bear proofed in this area. If you were in an area where there were a lot of bears, then yes. Down here, a good fitting lid is probably enough to do it. But I also strongly suggest that you keep anything that could be potential bear food off of your screen porches, because they're not always little and cuddly like this guy. But even as little and cuddly as he is, if you look at the ends of his toes, he has long, sharp, pointy things there, which if you were going to try to hug him might result in some slight loss of your blood. So let's not do that.
Josh, it's Jody. I do have a question. Size-wise, is there any size difference that you might see between the black bears here and what you might find in other locations?
So unlike the panthers, Florida does have its own subspecies of black bear. And one of the major differences is the size. They are quite a bit smaller than most other black bear populations that you find. And that's not uncommon for Florida. If you look at our deer, a lot of people make fun of our deer that we have down here. The further south you get, the smaller they get. You get down into the Keys, and now the deer are basically the size of dogs. So the same is true for bears. Our bears are something like 2/3 of the average size of a bear that you might find in, let's say, the Adirondack Mountain area. So again, that's weather related. They don't need to be as big. They don't need to hold in as much warmth. They don't need to be able to hold as much fat to keep them through the winter. So if you don't need to be as large, then be a little bit smaller. It's easier for you to find calories that way.
Great, thanks.
Who's afraid of a big bad wolf? Coyotes are animals that freak out a lot of people. They're not used to the idea of having wild dogs running around loose in their neighborhoods. And a lot of people get worried about their pets. They get worried about their dogs and their cats. And they honestly, they should be. Coyotes are pack hunters. They are fully capable of killing dogs and cats, even dogs of larger size than you would expect. But obviously, the smaller the animal is, the more at risk it's going to be. And they aren't real shy about coming into neighborhoods and other populated areas. These are animals that get along very well with people. If you look at the modern eastern coyote, this is not the same as the coyotes that we've found out west for a long, long time. They have changed over the years as they moved eastwards. They do have some dog DNA and they do have some wolf DNA. So this is not quite the scrawny little coyote that you might be used to from way out west in Nevada and California. These are larger animals and, again, potentially more dangerous because of that. Now, coyotes get a lot of hate, but they may actually be considered a native animal, depending on how you define that. Number one, nobody brought coyotes here to Florida or anywhere in the eastern US. They brought themselves. They migrated all on their own, partly because we killed off wolves in the eastern US and here in the southeast, the red wolf in particular. So coyotes are here and they are basically filling the ecological niche of those wolves that are gone now. They also, if you look back into the fossil record, you'll find that in the Pleistocene, there are coyote records in Florida. You can find coyote teeth occasionally in some of the fossil beds, and they have found other bones as well, proving that coyotes used to live here before we had climate changing and before it became wetter and drove the coyotes out back further west and brought the red wolves down here. So now that the red wolves are gone, we've just got the coyotes moving back in. So a lot of people are not going to accept that because they don't like the idea of coyotes being here. And I totally understand that, but best thing you can do is keep your pets indoors. If you have outdoor cats here in Southwest Florida, you're just asking for something to eat them. If not the coyotes, then you've got the bobcats that we talked about earlier. You've got the possibility of the bears, but what I would really be worried about would be the great horned owls, which are used to eating cat-sized prey because they eat a lot of skunks. And a cat even kind of looks a little bit like a skunk when you're looking down on it from above. So really, an outdoor cat here is just being thrown into the food chain. So I would strongly suggest that you keep your cats indoors. You will hear the occasional horror story of somebody who's out walking a dog and has a coyote come and take it right off the leash. And that is a possibility that happens, but the reason that it becomes big news is because it's a rare thing. It's not a normal behavior for a coyote. So I wouldn't worry too much about the coyotes, especially if you have seen them in your neighborhood or if you hear them out there howling. Don't freak out about it. It's just part of Florida's lovely nature as long as you don't try to hug them. This is one that most people are not aware even lives in Florida. Bison, aka American buffalo, are an emblem of the American West, but believe it or not, they are native here in Florida. And there is one place in the state that you can find a semi-wild herd roaming semi-free, although they are behind a fence, but it's a large area. It's Paynes Prairie. Let's see, what is that called? Paynes Prairie State Park. It's up north in the Gainesville area, and it's one of the few places in the southeast where you'll be able to see bison actually going out there and being bison. Now, if we were to be able to transport back in time about 10,000 years, you would find wild free roaming bison throughout Florida, especially in the prairie type areas, but also in some cases right through the forests. So this is an animal that, again, is native here, does belong here. We just happened to kill them all off a long time ago, which is why you don't have bison traipsing through your neighborhood. And while that idea seems strange, if you go to Maine, they have moose that traipse through the neighborhoods. If you go out to Colorado, they have elk that traipse through the neighborhoods. So what's the difference if it's just a big cow instead of a big deer? So I propose that we reintroduce bison everywhere throughout the state of Florida, and anybody who's scared of them can leave. This is a cow. And you might say, well, why did you put a cow, which is obviously a domestic animal, on this list? Well, for one reason, because there are areas, for example, the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area in Punta Gorda, where you have cattle roaming free. And this cow was actually photographed at the Babcock Webb WMA. And you basically need to think of them as wild animals out there because they kind of act like wild animals. They do not come up to you to have their heads scratched. They do not want you to pet them. They do not want to be hugged. I would tend to think of them more like these guys than I would think of them as your friendly neighborhood dairy cow. And I grew up around cows on a cattle ranch in DeSoto County. I'm very familiar with the damage that cattle can do to people. I've seen people have bones broken. I've seen people thrown to the ground. I've seen people knocked off horses by cattle. It's not really something that you want to mess with. They are large, and especially if they feel defensive because they think you're coming after their calves, they can put a hurting on you. So be careful around cattle that you see out in the wild, and do not assume that they want to be hugged. Big birds. Big birds are something that a lot of people like to look at from afar, and that's really the best way to deal with them. But sometimes people want to start feeding those big birds because they're used to feeding the little ones. So why not feed the larger ones as well? So this is a pair of sandhill cranes photographed at Myakka River State Park, where I kept my distance from them as they foraged naturally on their own. If you have these birds in your neighborhood, then you might feel obligated to start feeding them something because they may ask you for handouts, probably because other people have fed them something. Common things that people feed them include hot dogs, peanuts, and mealworms.
Look at everybody ideas now.
Well, these are things that these birds will eat, but you really shouldn't feed them any of these things. Number one, it's not a balanced diet for any of them. Number two, it takes what used to be a beautiful wild animal and turns him into a beggar. And number three, it puts you in significant danger because I don't know if you noticed, but compare the shape of that bird's beak to a spear point. And then look at that long, powerful neck that drives that beak. So if you don't give the food fast enough, or if you drop the food on the ground and the bird goes for it and misses it, then you could just as easily end up getting stabbed. And they can get fairly aggressive once they've been fed and want to continue to be fed. So the best thing to do is to not start that cycle. I understand the urge to hug them and to feed them, but you're much better off appreciating those birds from afar. And the same is true of this one, which is a great blue heron. This one was photographed at Ollie's Pond Park here in Port Charlotte, and the prey that it's got is a fairly large salamander called a greater siren. That is not by any means the biggest prey that these birds can take. Again, they have a spear on the front of their face and a very strong neck that drives that spear. They are known to feed on a wide variety of things, mostly fish, but also things like baby alligators, things like muskrats, things like full-grown marsh rabbits. They also eat a lot of juvenile birds of other species. So ducklings, baby moorhens, even the occasional smaller heron. They are not something that you really want to mess with. If these things grew to be 12 feet high, they would be out there after your grandchildren. So this is truly a T-Rex among modern birds. And we are quite fortunate as a species that they don't get any bigger than they do, because if they did, we would almost assuredly be on the menu. I'm sorry, did I scare you, Kate?
This is very informative.
Oh, okay. You looked a little frightened over there. Looked like you were retreating a little further away from the screen. Burmese pythons. This is one that gets a lot of news coverage. Obviously, this isn't something that you want to hug out there. This is something that you want to try to avoid. We don't have berms in Charlotte County yet, at least not in any kind of appreciable numbers. It still gets too cold in the wintertime here for them. Now, there is some concern that they might start to migrate northward because we have a lot of gopher tortoises. And if the pythons can figure out that gopher tortoise dens might make a good refuge during the winter months, then we may have a problem with those animals continuing to expand northwards. But as it is right now, really anything north of the Caloosahatchee, you're unlikely to see them. But if you go traveling and you go down into the Everglades, hang out in Everglades National Park, or go down to Collier County someplace, then you become much more likely to encounter these things if you make the effort to do it. The thing about these pythons is they are very cryptic, and cryptic means that they stay hidden. Not only is their color great for that, but also their habits are great for that. They prefer to stay tucked away. You're looking at an animal that, even taking this photograph, is highly unlikely because you just don't see them out in the open like this. Sometimes you might see one crossing a road, sometimes you might see one in a ditch, but normally they're animals that stay as hidden as they possibly can. So inside of down timber, great place to be. In the Everglades, they squeeze themselves down into limestone cracks and literally just disappear for weeks on end. This is an animal that does its very best to stay hidden. But when they come out because they're looking for one of two things: either a mate to create more of these pythons or something to eat. And it's that part that's become the real problem. Pythons have become the dominant predator across most of the Everglades. They're eating most of the mammals are well within their size range. Perhaps the biggest pigs and deer and panthers are outside of it, but pretty much everything else they can eat. They eat a lot of birds. If you go down to the Everglades, you'll notice that most of your wading birds have certainly reduced, and in some areas it seems like they've almost disappeared, and that's probably due to python appetites. They are also willing to take on alligators, which they've shown. There have been some photos that have gone viral over the years of python versus alligator fights, which often result in the deaths of both animals, especially if the alligator is big. But I'm sure with the smaller alligators, a lot of them do just end up sliding right down those python throats. So this is something that is not so much a problem for you and I directly, but for the wildlife that lives in the areas where these snakes move into. Pretty much everything is on the menu, and that becomes a big, big problem for Florida. Speaking of gators, here's one at the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, just hanging out. This gator was spotted getting some sun during the winter time, which they do a lot. If you have not had the opportunity to see an alligator, and I know that a lot of people who freshly moved to Florida think that there's alligators just everywhere. And while it's possible that literally any body of fresh water in the state might hold a gator or two, you just don't see them as often as you might think that you would. It's going to sound a little odd, but the best time to see a gator is on a really cold, sunny morning. If you go out after a chilly night when the sun has come up, especially after a cold front, those animals are going to want to move up onto a sunny bank and start to bask like this animal's doing. So as you can see, he's not green, he's black. And that's the typical color for a Florida alligator. If you see a green one, he's either been basking in shallow water for a long time and he's covered with algae, or he's just come out of a pond that's covered in duckweed. So it's actually the vegetation that's green. So this is a very typical color for an adult or near adult alligator. And he's colored that way because he needs to absorb some heat before he can get moving. And on a chilly winter morning, you need to absorb a lot of heat. So if you want to see gators, go look on areas like the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, like the canals that crisscross this area, but look on a cold winter morning and you're much more likely to see these animals. Now, don't get close to them, obviously, because they're going to attack you. No, because you're going to scare them. And you're going to scare them back into that cold, cold water where they don't really need to be. He needs to be sitting up on that bank, getting nice and warm. The likelihood of one of these animals attacking you is very low. We have seen them attack people over food, however, usually because somebody has fed one, because while this animal may not look very huggable, this one certainly does. This is a cute little baby alligator, probably about 5 months old. And when they're this size, they're adorable and everybody wants to feed them something. Unfortunately, when they get to this size, or even bigger than that, they remember having been fed and they remember that humans are a food source, and then they want to come after you to be fed. So people are fishing and you have alligators show up and try to steal their catches. People are walking dogs along a pond bank and they come up because they associate people with food. And sure enough, look at that. There is a snack-sized dog right there. So they go after it. That's how it happens that people are getting attacked so often by gators. The other thing is people sometimes do really dumb things, like, for example, going for a swim at night. That is not wise to do anywhere in Florida. Even if you're going to swim in your pool, you should probably shine a light in it just to make sure, because gators have popped up in people's pools before. But swimming after dark is not a smart thing to do when there may be predatory things in the water. And again, let me point out, any body of fresh water in Florida might hold an alligator. So be gator smart, don't get gator bit, and don't try to hug them. And don't feed them. Now, nobody wants to hug this thing. This is an American crocodile, not as closely related to alligators as you might think. And if you look at his face, you can see that he has a much more dangerous look to him. This is a large adult. His eye looks very small in relation to his head, and certainly smaller than the alligator's eye does in relation to his head. And you can see that we have a very good view of all of those teeth. All of those teeth are showing, even though his mouth is fully closed. This is one good way for you to identify a crocodile. Now you might think, well, I don't need to worry about that because we don't have crocodiles here. Well, that's mostly true right now, but that situation is changing. So crocodiles are native to Florida's west coast in saltwater and brackish water areas as far north as Tampa Bay. They belong in our estuaries. They are supposed to be here. Again, this is an animal that's been persecuted by people over the years, and their range has contracted and contracted to the point that they're really only abundant in a very small area of South Florida. But that population is expanding. We have seen a few turning up further north. There was one that was very well known living on Sanibel a couple of years ago. We had pictures of one a couple of years ago that was cruising the canals, the canals of Punta Gorda Isles. So these are animals of expanding their range and might be coming to a canal near you. So again, no more dangerous than an alligator, truthfully, because we're going to avoid them, we're going to stay away from them, and we're definitely not going to feed them, even when they're cute little babies like this cute little alligator. And actually, crocodile babies aren't quite as cute because they don't have the color. So, but no feeding, none of them. Now here's something that certainly everybody would want to hug. And why wouldn't you? It's an adorable sea turtle. In this case, a loggerhead, which is the big sea turtle that we commonly see here that nests on our beaches. If you've been out to the beaches and you've seen the sea turtle nests that are roped off, this is probably the turtle that showed up there and laid a nest full of eggs. This is not an animal to mess with, though. When they're on the beach like this animal is extremely tired. She's just gone through a very trying ordeal of hauling herself up onto the sand. She's very heavy when she gets out of the water. She's used to the water supporting all of her weight. And now suddenly she has 300 pounds of turtle that she has to drag around with those flippers because she's got to get way up onto dry sand to lay her eggs. This is one of the hardest things that she's done in her life. And now once she's done it, she has to drag herself back to the sand. So not a good idea to mess with her during that kind of a trying ordeal, because guess what she's going to do? That big old loggerhead sea turtles feed on lots of different things, but among them are crabs and lobsters. And how does a turtle eat a lobster? Well, you just crush it. So if she's able to chomp down on crabs and lobsters and just crush them and chew them up, what do you think happens if she gets upset with you and takes a chomp at you? Yeah, not good. So we've seen this with turtles that have been accidentally caught on hook and line because, like I said, they do eat a lot of things, and sometimes that includes fishermen's baits when we're out there reef fishing, targeting groups. Very occasionally somebody will hook into a sea turtle, and a hooked sea turtle is not a happy sea turtle, and they have to be unhooked. That's the law. You can't just turn them loose with the hook in them. So you got to get that hook out of them. They use wooden blocks and special tools to get the hooks out of them. The wood is there to get bitten, because we already know that the turtle is going to try to bite you as soon as you mess with it. So yes, they are not animals that you really want to mess with, not animals that you really want to hug. Although, if you happen to be scuba diving, they are animals that you can relatively safely interact with, because they don't see you as a threat when everybody's underwater, when you're not trying to haul them up to the top, when you're not messing with them on the sand. So that might be the one caveat, is that yes, you can actually interact with these animals while you're in the water, and that's relatively safe. Still, I don't know if I'd go for a full hug.
And it might be illegal.
Well, sure, it might be illegal, but lots of things are illegal. I mean, I drove 56 miles an hour getting here. You coming after me?
You've got that on recording.
I don't care. It's an admission. That's all they've got. So they are protected by law. You are not allowed to harass them. However, they will often swim up to divers because they are curious animals. So if one comes up to you, you don't need to swim away from it. You're allowed to have it come up to you. If you're chasing after it to try to hug it, well, that constitutes harassment. So we don't do that. It's a slight bit of a gray area on whether you can interact with something that chooses to interact with you, which also applies to this next animal, which is the West Indian manatee. Called West Indian because it's common through the West Indies, but also a native here in Florida. A lot of people get confused by that name, West Indian manatee, and think that somehow manatees are not native to Florida. There's a lot of false rumors out there about them being brought here to feed railroad workers or to feed slaves on plantations. None of that stuff is true. These animals totally belong here. If you go fossil hunting in the Peace River, you can find lots of manatee pieces. They're pretty common fossils out there, and it means that manatees have been here in Florida for way longer than human beings have. So I chose this photo because it shows how we often see manatees, which is basically their cute little snouts popping up out of the water as they come up to you at your dock or at your boat, wanting to check you out and see what's going on. Now, a lot of people will see this as a manatee asking for something, and a lot of people see it as a manatee asking for water. I strongly suggest that you do not give them water. Number one, the water that you have to offer them is chlorinated, and we're not really sure of the effects of chlorine on manatees. A lot of animals are more sensitive to chlorine than people are. But the other bigger thing is you're actually changing the behaviors of these animals when you give them water. They are supposed to migrate. Now remember, your canal is not a natural part of the ecosystem. It's not really supposed to be there. So the animals coming into the canals is odd enough already. There's very little food for them there. These are vegetarians that mostly eat seagrasses. They do also eat some floating vegetation such as water lettuce and water hyacinths, but you don't have a whole lot to eat in most of our saltwater canals. They're coming in because they recognize that there are sources of fresh water there. Natural sources of fresh water, not a whole lot we can do about. Where you have freshwater runoff dumping into canals, manatees are drawn to that. But you also have people who are watering them from hoses, especially during dry seasons when the manatees are going around looking for water. The problem becomes, if they want to stay in the canals during the dry season, remember the dry season is also our cold season, and canals can get pretty cold pretty quick, and there's no food source for the manatees in there. So you have animals that sometimes end up in places where they really shouldn't be because they've stayed there for the water. So that's not really something that we want to do to these animals. We want to allow them to migrate up the rivers or migrate into warmer areas where they actually will be able to find some food, which are much better places for them to spend the winter anyway. A lot of people want to hug a manatee. I advise against it for several reasons. Number one, it's illegal to approach them. Again, considered harassment. However, if a manatee approaches you, which is likely in some of the springs in North Florida, all you can really do is just kind of sit still and let him approach you, because again, these are very curious animals. However, they often have barnacles on their skin and other marine growth, which could hurt you. Barnacles will slice you wide open if you tried to get too close to them. And a manatee can move very fast. So think of him holding up a barnacle against you and swimming away rapidly, almost like somebody knifing you while they're mugging you. It's not going to be a pleasant situation. Even worse, if you see manatees at the beach that are in a large gathering, a lot of people get very excited by that and they want to go hang out with the manatees over there. Unfortunately, that's a mating herd, and manatees in a mating herd are focused on just one thing. And I'm going to give you just one guess what that just one thing is. And only one male can mate with the female at a time, but there are often multiple males there trying to make an attempt. And what they're doing in the meantime, while they wait their turn, is they're showing their domination of each other by jumping up on top of each other and trying to push each other to the bottom. If you get into the middle of that and a manatee is able to push you to the bottom, well, you can't hold your breath as long as a manatee can. And also, these are very large, very heavy, very strong animals. It would be not out of the possibility to get drowned by getting into the middle of a manatee mating herd. And that's not something that you really want in your obituary, is it? I mean, it would be interesting, but we probably shouldn't have it in the obituary.
Sounds like a very Florida man story.
Deeply. Bottlenose dolphins, everybody's favorite huggable water creatures. We've got a big problem going on with bottlenose dolphins right now, and it's entirely because people have found them to be super huggable. What they've been doing with them is not so much hugging them, but rather feeding them to encourage interactions with people. And dolphins are very trainable, even in the wild. Dolphins naturally hunt with each other. They are cooperative hunters. If you look around online, you can find videos. I've seen them in various documentaries of dolphins doing those types of group hunts where they will make muds and scatter a school of mullet and freak the mullet out, and then mullet only have one way to go, and the one way to go ends up in another dolphin's mouth. So you end up with dolphins that know that they can hunt together in groups. They see fishermen as part of their group hunt, and they see us catching fish and then releasing fish, putting the fish back in the water. They think that we're putting the fish back in the water for their benefit. And that really started with people who were feeding dolphins, and they came to associate human beings with food. Before that, they kind of thought of us as rivals, and they mostly stayed away from us. But now it's gotten to the point that multiple generations of dolphins have trained their calves that human fishermen are a great source of food. So now we have a problem because people are out there, they're catching and releasing fish. The dolphins are finding them and hanging out with them and then eating all the fish that they release. If you're a recreational fisherman, that's not great. If you're a charter fisherman, though, and you need to rely on those fish for your income, for your business, then it becomes a real problem. And you've got some people who are saying some very unpleasant things about dolphins. I was just reading on Facebook the other day about a charter captain who was fantasizing about taking his hunting rifle out on the water and starting to peg some dolphins. Now, I don't think he's going to do it, but enough people start saying things like that, and somebody eventually is going to do it. So we've taken an animal that, just through love and wanting to spend some time with them, we've now made a huge problem for ourselves that is becoming a huge problem for the animal. And not only that, but most people who are feeding dolphins aren't offering them something that a dolphin really should eat. You're not feeding them small bait fish or squid. A lot of people are feeding them things like chunks of a sandwich or potato chips because they can watch the dolphin eat that. And that's not great for dolphins. So we've had a big problem with people feeding dolphins becoming a much larger problem now. And I'm not really quite sure how that one's going to end because we're still in the middle of this story. So stay tuned, but I'm not real happy with it. This is a Hawaiian monk seal, and he is a stand-in for a Caribbean monk seal, which is something that you could have hugged back in the 1800s here in Florida, but now you don't really have the chance to because Caribbean are all gone. They are an extinct species. The last one that was seen in Florida was in Key West in 1922. And guess what happened to that one? Somebody shot it. So this is a species that we don't see anymore. And it's just a reminder that, yes, you actually can kill off the animals that we like so much just because People want to be close to them because people want to interact with them, because people want to utilize their habitats. This is an animal that should be relatively common on Florida's beaches, but instead is completely gone, and it's 100% because of people. Our last one to look at that you should not hug, we have sharks. Now this shark, those of you who are fishermen or divers may recognize it from the two little hangers downers on its mouth. No, those are not fangs. Those are small tendrils. This is a nurse shark. Those tendrils are soft, kind of like the barbels on a catfish, and they function the same way. They allow this fish to feel its food and to taste it before it eats it. Now, we talked about the sea turtles and how they feed on things like whole crabs and lobsters, and that makes them dangerous. A lot of people think that nurse sharks, because they don't have the big sharp teeth of other sharks, are not dangerous at all. But the truth is that nurse sharks feed on a lot of the same things that a loggerhead sea turtle does. They have a pavement of teeth in their mouths, and they have incredibly strong jaw muscles in order to crush those animals. So getting any part of a nurse shark is probably not great. They are going to do some damage to you if they get the chance. And furthermore, they have mouths that are designed for suction. So they will suck foods in to the back part of their mouths where they can be crushed. So if you were to, let's say, hug this fish and it were, let's say, to open its mouth and get a hold of your chest, then that's not good, because it's going to adhere to you while it's also trying to crush whatever bits of meat off of you it can get into its mouth. So please don't hug the nurse sharks, even though everybody says they're not dangerous. Everybody is a moron in this case. One last shark that people want to hug and swim with. This is a whale shark. Whale sharks, as long as they stay on the surface, are relatively innocuous to swim with. There are places in this world where you can go and you can swim with whale sharks for a fee. However, be very careful if you decide to do this. I was reading an old book by Jacques Cousteau, and in it he was describing how one of his cameraman divers was almost killed by a whale shark. He said it was a big one, about 45 feet long, but the fish had swum past him, and after it swam past him, it was paddling its tail back and forth and just casually happened to hit the guy in the head and knocked his mask off, and he was barely able to get it back on, but they were down about 25 feet underwater. For an average diver down 25 feet underwater, losing your mask can be a real problem if you can't get it back on. And if you get disoriented because you just were swimming with a large shark, you could die. So that's what this comes down to, is we don't want to harm the animals. We don't want to harm you. Can you hug them? The answer is unfortunately no. If you want to hug something, I strongly suggest a Frenchie. Frenchies are extremely huggable, and they will happily hug you back. So that's the direction that I would go
As
with.
in a French bulldog?
Well, naturally a French bulldog.
Let's just clarify. Cool.
Or a
Awesome.
person from France. I guess that could work too,
Well, you need their consent first.
naturally.
Awesome, Josh. That was great. Thank you. I am going to launch. We just have a brief quiz for people who are attending to sort of measure everybody's engagement and enjoyment of the program. And while y'all are doing